עכשיו באיחור קצר מאוד בלוז, אני רוצה להזמין לבמה את פרופסור שייזף רפאלי, ראש מרכז שגיא לחקר האינטרנט, ואני אציין גם שמרכז שגיא תמך בכנס הזה בשנותיו הראשונות, ואפילו אירח אותנו שנה אחת, ואני רוצה להזמין את יושב ראש הוועד המנהל של קרן ויקימדיה העולמית, שבא אלינו, מר יאן בארט דה וריד, לעלות לבמה, שזף יראיין אותו.
שתי מילים בעברית, ברכות ליוצרים וליזמים, מאוד יפה ומאוד מעניין. I just thank the entrepreneurs and creators. ותודה לאכסניה, ותודה למארגנים, ותודה למתנדבים, וסליחה שמעכשיו נעבור לאנגלית. It's an honor and a pleasure to host Jan Bart De Vreede, the chairman of Wikimedia Foundation Board of Trustees here in Israel. In his second visit here in Israel, yes. Hopefully yes. Only the early two among many visits here in Israel. It is the Wikimedia Foundation is a fairly little known organization with an enormously large impact on knowledge, culture, and thought around the world. And at the top of the pyramid of this huge operation is Jan. Among other things, Jan is a big globetrotter. What did you tell me last night? 4 transatlantic visits in 16 weeks. So and that's only the beginning. Some of his background, about which he will elaborate in just a second, is in the Maldives and in Sri Lanka and in Kenya, and even makes it to faraway places such as Herzliya. Jan, can we begin with your introducing yourself rather than I doing it personally and professionally?
Okay, you did such a good job. So I'm Jan Bart De Vreede. I'm the chair of the board of the Wikimedia Foundation. In my other work, I work for the Kennis Foundation in the Netherlands, which is involved with education, and a lot of my work revolves around open educational resources. I became involved with Wikimedia about 10 years ago when I started attending the first Wikimedia conference ever. And I was just sent there by my foundation, and it's like, how do these people organize themselves? Let's see if we can learn something about that and see how teachers can organize themselves in the Netherlands as well, and how what lessons can we learn? And I was immediately captivated, and I went to the next conference, and then somewhere along the line I was asked, do you want to consider joining the board? And I'm like, okay. This is a small operation. I think 3 people worked at the foundation at that time. And so far, I think my real crowning achievement is hiring someone who had the real crowning achievement of making the foundation what it is today. We hired Sue Gardner as our first real executive director with a large staff, 183 people. For us, that's large. Compared to Wikimedia Israel, it's large. Compared to any of the other top 10 websites which we are a part of, it's incredibly small. If you think about who's working at Facebook, if you think about Google, the thousands and thousands of people working there, we have 183 people. One of which is here and was gracious enough to help me with the translation, so I got most of the speech before this. But we have a lot of people working for us who are also volunteers, who get involved in Wikimedia out of passion and are able to make that their job. And I love to be sort of involved with them as a chair of the board of trustees. I became a chair last year. The interesting thing about our board is that its majority is community elected. So we have 5 members which are in some way selected or elected by the community. Anybody who has a certain number of edits can vote. We have Jimmy Wales, and then we have 4 appointed members. And I think the mix is really important, but it's really interesting to see we're always struggling with, are we like the top of the enormous pyramid, or really are we just, the board of trustees for a 183 people organization? And it's a really difficult thing to determine, because at some point we cannot determine for the movement at all, just like the foundation cannot determine who does what. Most countries have, most projects have more and more active communities with active chapters like Wikimedia Israel, who do their own thing. Interestingly, and share that with others and give good examples. And who are we to get involved at all? We try not to get involved in any of that. So editing, policy, anything like that, we don't really get involved in. So on the one hand, people have introduced me as the most powerful man in knowledge. And on the other hand, they've said, but he doesn't edit, so he doesn't really matter. And that last one is actually true.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on the tension between editing as one function and the vast numbers of other sorts of activities that constitute the presence of Wikipedia and Wikimedia Foundation?
You have to elaborate a little bit more. I'm not sure I understand the question.
All right. The foundation is based on a large number of volunteers. It also has a budget, not huge, but also not negligible. And we're collected here to talk about the future of Wikipedia and Wikimedia. And the question is, what do you think is the important, what do you think are the important components in addition to the volunteers, most of the audience here?
I think in addition to the volunteers, I think the most important component which we as a foundation can facilitate is exactly what was mentioned before by the Dean, and which is making sure we get technology to the place where we're actually prepared for the future. I can talk about that in a minute. But I think the most important part we can play is not just what can we do in addition to the volunteers, but no, how can we enable the volunteers? How can we make sure that the people who are involved in adding content or organizing things or doing whatever they want to help us promote our mission, which is the sum of all knowledge. We've made a sort of an interesting high bar, but how can we facilitate those people and help them achieve their goals? Because whatever we do with 183 or 200 or 250 people will never scale to the amount of impact that enabling volunteers will. So that's the most important part.
I guess there are two things that were discussed earlier today. One was the Dean's call for more technology and specifically more algorithms and a reinvention of Wikipedia so that it can persist into the future. And the other was the idea represented by this application developed by the students that even Wikipedia has too much information, that to quote them, we're not equipped to deal with that much information. What we need to do is to distill even smaller pieces of information. Is that the direction that Wikipedia and Wikimedia should take in your view? Are those the directions?
Well, first to get on about the clue application, there was a box there in the diagram which said Wiki Brains, which I'm assuming is your back end for your application, or this is how you distill the information?
It's in the API.
Okay. Because one of the things which I think is important is it's not so much up to us to determine in what way this information is consumed. We want to be able to present the right way, and this is a good example of another way of presenting it. But what is in our best interest is making sure that the data is available in a way that makes it possible for anybody to present it in any way. If that's a clue application, if that's a news sticker below a TV screen, if that's data mining, if that's any other research, anything else you can do, if we can get that data available in an open access fashion so everybody can use it whatever way, we're being much more effective than just adding the one web page. And I think that's one of the things we're moving towards, which is a big development. So we're moving towards the project's called Wikidata, and it has structured information. And it basically contains a lot of information and the relationships between that information. So there are simple things like this person was born then, died at that age, he or she was related to this person and had a certain function within the government or whatever. All those things are structured in data. Rather than an article, they're now structurally stored in Wikidata projects. And that means if we translate the labels son of, born on, etc., to any language, we can immediately present that information in that language. So we can automatically not just generate articles on it, but also provide the data in a local fashion to a lot of different audiences, which we could never reach before. And our biggest challenge in that is how do we do that and at the same time enable new volunteers to add data to that in a new way, to be able to add context to it, to add text to it, to add anything which will add value to it. How do we make it much easier rather than an edit button, which scares off a lot of people? If you have your mobile phone, there's a really good app now to add pictures of local places. You can even find places where we don't have pictures of yet, as in please go there and take a picture with your smartphone. And how about making it much easier to contribute? For example, by if you're not able to contribute more than a few seconds of your time, how about adding those 3 keywords? Because in your opinion, these are the 3 keywords. In your fashion, which is a very easy way to do it, or in any other fashion. And for us, it's interesting to see if we share the data in such an open way, can we also include the data we get back? So if we give the whole thing accessible, can we get access to what clues did people find relevant and what they did not find relevant? How does that teach us the whole sum of knowledge, what we know about that topic? So these are really exciting times for that.
So if I could twist your arm, would you rank the innovations in order of importance and promise? Is it pictures first, semantic and structure first? Is it mobile interface first? Is it different languages first? Which one would come first for you?
Personally, I would say Wikidata is the most important development because it enables a lot of the other things you're talking about. I think, secondly, which excites me more actually as a person, is the Wikipedia Zero initiative, which means accessibility to audiences that have never been able to reach us before. Wikipedia Zero is a project based on developing countries where we make deals with telecom providers and ask them to provide Wikipedia access on the phone for free without a data subscription. That means that a lot of people who never have access to it because they don't have a computer with a computer connection to the internet, but they do have mobile phones, all of a sudden get to reach this audience. It's one of our fastest growing audiences, and it's a really good way for us to reach a new audience which we would never otherwise be able to reach.
So in the context of Wikipedia Zero and similar innovations, Jan has a scheduled meeting with the Minister of Education, Israeli Minister of Education, tomorrow morning. And I was wondering what priorities would lead you into that conversation. What do you think should be presented to politicians here and elsewhere in regards to Wikipedia?
I think one of the most exciting things we have for education is both a Wikipedia for and by children, which is a really interesting concept we're working on in the Netherlands where I'm from. There's a project called WikiKids, which has as a goal to have a Wikipedia not just for children, but written by children, and it teaches children how to gather information. We were talking about this last night, that you could, children can go into any place and interview people that, for example, are still Holocaust survivors and ask them and document their story and make an educational experience, which is not just for them themselves, but allows it to share that knowledge with everyone else and allows other children to understand in their words. So I think that's a really exciting development, and I gather that some of it is already going on. And secondly, I think the potential which we see a lot is we have a project called Wikiversity, which is all about writing open educational courses. It's not really that successful because I think the interface is a large barrier for teachers. But what is very exciting is to see that a lot of our material is used as a resource in open education materials. So if teachers are writing their own plans, they now have references to articles which are properly referenced. So they have a lot of background material, artwork, etc., to not just spice up, but also really strengthen the material they make. And I think those are two exciting things to talk about with the minister.
So you have a chance to be in touch with chapters around the world. And what I'd like to ask you to do is to share some of our conversation from last night about really cool projects that were locally developed in our grassroots developments regarding Wiki. You mentioned Wiki Zero, you mentioned Wikidata, you mentioned Wikiversity. Are there other innovations and startups that you think are worth mentioning to this audience?
Well, it's important to remember that Wikipedia, Wiki Loves Monuments was started off as a chapter project and still is a chapter project, which is somebody thought of this like, how can we get more pictures of this? And then they started off by doing this, and we had Wiki Loves Art, and all those kind of things are started by different individuals doing really cool small projects. And we have a session every year at Wikimedia, which is called Cool Projects, which is, as the name implies, they have sort of like everybody presents their pitch, and at the end they sort of have an election. I was informed, and I regret that I did not know this, that Wiki Air won last year, which is a project which involves a lot of pilots who need to get their flying hours in Israel, taking along photographers and taking a lot of aerial pictures of different areas, which is a really cool project. It's really cool. On the other hand, I was told about a project here which goes into some of the less good educational areas and works in schools to help improve articles about the area and to basically sort of virally try and spread the thought that you can also edit Wikimedia. I think it's part of a good, a lot of projects we see, it's a part of a really good media education when you teach children how easy they can edit it, because the one step is, okay, I can easily edit this, and the second step is, if I can easily edit this, what does that mean for all the other stuff on the internet? And there might not be an edit button, but how reliable is it, and how to learn about sourcing, etc. So the cool projects where you see local projects, where you see people reaching out into education, which is my field of passion, so that's why I'm more enthusiastic about it. But using that as part of a sort of media education curriculum, that is really cool, and those are really cool projects.
Do you expect there's much growth room for more projects and more innovation, or are we now straightening up and pretty much exhausting the...
If I said we're exhausted, we're done, then I could just walk off now.
That's right.
No, of course. We've done this much. No, and I think we have, as Itzik explained, we have 40+ chapters across the world. And one of the first things a chapter does, we have a really good system of funds are raised in a central fashion. They all go through our central office. The disbursement of these funds goes through a volunteer committee, which actually looks at all the different chapter plans and then rates them and says, okay, you can have this much money for your plan, etc. So the first year you see a chapter often going for something relatively safe, like Wiki does monuments, and because it's been done and we've learned lessons and we know how to make it a success. And that's not a problem. And at the same time, how do we make sure that the next year around they do bold things and they try new things and they share their failures as well as their successes? But there is so much more to do. If you see Wikimedia, if you have the luxury to go, is a conference once a year where all the enthusiasts come together. We've had ours in Haifa 3 years ago, and it's just the enthusiasm and the number of ideas are just, for me, it's the most exhausting conference ever and the most energizing one for the whole year, because you see so many people on an individual level giving their pitches. Even now, for the past month, people have been pitching their ideas to be able to present there. And a lot of ideas can't make it because there's just too many. But even the ideas that are being pitched and don't make it excite me. So there's so much more to do. And I think the power continually comes back to making sure that everybody's able to do that, either through providing things in a structured fashion or making just a little bit more money available to do something small like micro grants. Whatever, all those small things should always be in the spirit of enabling the volunteer.
All right, so we talked about the enthusiasm and we talked about the cool projects. We colored a rosy future. Are there any challenges?
I'm not sure I colored a rosy future. I said we'd had this much done. We have the sum of all knowledge, so that's a sort of an interesting high bar. We're nowhere near that yet. We're reaching new audiences all the time. I think that's really important. But our big concern is of course, the editors. How do we ensure that we have enough editors to continue our work? And that involves several things. I've been told that the Israeli of the Hebrew Wikipedia is similar to the English Wikipedia. If you as a non-tech person press the edit button, those of you that are old enough like me will recognize this. This is like WordPerfect underwater code, but more complex. And those of you that are younger, I just don't get it. It's really complex, it's intimidating. So pressing the edit button is the first part of the battle, and then making sure people continue to do things is a second. And we're getting with a visual editor, hopefully being able to solve that problem. It's something that's really going to make a difference. But then we have the second problem. Once you've made your edit, you need to make sure it stays there. And that means that established editors and established community need to in some way make sure they welcome new users and make sure that new editors are being treated kindly. I've heard someone say this once. I said, what do you do in Wikipedia? And she goes, I don't really do much. I just help new editors. I'm like, well, that actually scales much better than writing your own articles. And she goes, I guess so. And it really wasn't very much a respected thing to help new people because it's not really creating knowledge. And at the same time, I think that's exactly what we need. We need a better mentality of helping people, not just reverting their edits and saying, this was not proper or what you wrote, and not even a good explanation, but just saying, reverted, end of story. I don't have time to explain this to every user. Well, we better take the time. So it's a big problem there. And at the same time, we need to be able to retain those editors in the long run and make sure they remain involved. We have a sort of definition problem. We have active editors and we have very active editors. And very active editors are those that keep a lot of the projects going. But even very active editors people run out of energy at some point. Life events happen and things happen, and we need to make sure that we keep those people involved and also make sure that they don't become indispensable by being the last 3 editors of the project or something like that.
So you mentioned community relations and editor retention as 2 major challenges. I'm curious about the fact that you did not mention reliability. And I guess what I want to ask is, to what degree is that something that you think is the foundation's responsibility? Or shall we just trust the 84% in Itzik survey who trust Wikipedia and not worry about reliability and accuracy?
So reliability is the interesting thing, which is it's also a marketing thing. So I think, like I'm pretty sure that Encyclopedia Britannica was sort of undoubted in its time. You have a book right there in the cupboard, or a series of books rather, and it seems very impressive, and they come up with a new edition every so often, so you're like, this has got to be right. The internet automatically brings with it some level of distrust, and correctly so. So I think it's really important to look at projects where you see a lot of citation, and you see a lot of references, so you know that something you're looking at is not just an opinion, it's actually a sourced article. And I think we've gotten that reputation throughout the years. It's not really a concern at this point, but it relates back to the other point of having enough eyes to look at things. If you have enough editors, then you can also make sure those editors look at those articles, look at the changes. We have all kinds of technology to help them with that. But if the technology is there to help no one doing it, then we can't solve the problem. So we need to be able to do that. But it's not really a big part of our attention span right now. And it's also something we as a foundation don't get involved in. We don't get involved in a lot of policy within the projects.
Still, I will ask another policy-related question.
Good.
The recent decision by the European Court regarding privacy and deletion rights, I just read this morning a number, 15,000 or so Europeans have already applied to have their history erased on Google. And I guess Wikipedia is not far behind in our concerns. The Israeli Supreme Court passed a landmark decision with regards to privacy along very much the same lines. I was wondering whether Wikipedia and Wikimedia Foundation have a stance with regards to privacy vis-a-vis freedom of speech. Should they have a stance? Can they afford to stand on the sidelines and not get involved in this? What is your take on this?
It's interesting because while we try and stay away from individual editorial things, these are exactly the kind of things what the foundation is for. This is the only, no individual can sort of tackle this problem in Europe. I mean, you have to have an organized body to help and find out what this means. As far as we understand now, and I think the interpretation of the law will determine, but as far as we understand, it's the right to be forgotten by things like search engines, to make sure that they at some point don't show all the relevant of all the things that they know about you and keep on having up that one result which really annoys you. At the same time, it doesn't seem to apply, or it doesn't apply, to sourced articles about you. You cannot ask for your history to be erased, you ask for your searchability to be cleaned up. And that's a different interpretation. I think a lot of sources, we're not asking, the European Court is not asking newspapers to remove its articles on certain things that happened in the past. It's not asking things like Wikipedia to stop the summation of those articles in a structured fashion so you get the complete picture of someone, much to maybe the annoyance of some individuals, but the reality is that the sources are still very much something that is protected. And I think in Wikipedia we have an interesting thing is, we used to have a lot of complaints about people who said, why is my article on Wikipedia deleted? Am I not notable enough? Am I not important enough? And the bad news is the actual phrase is not notable, so that actually does imply. A lot of people don't have an article on Wikipedia, and that's rightly so. And I think the barrier between becoming notable and having an article about you is the same barrier that's crossed when at some point your private information to some degree is more public. And with private, I mean your date of birth and kinds of things, or your movies, or whatever you're involved in, especially in the entertainment industry. And a lot of people are actually kind of happy that they're in Wikipedia, because then there can be found and you can link to all kinds of stuff. And there's also people that are not happy with that. But if they've been in the news, then to some degree you have become someone who has a right to privacy to a large degree. And we don't go into all kinds of private details because we don't have them and we wouldn't want to share them anyway. But the encyclopedic knowledge is something that is very much, I think, a public part of an article, because if people are looking for it, then that's obviously, then they're looking for a reason. And it's not like they're looking at it for LinkedIn, like, I need to employ this person. No, it's, I need to find out who this is.
Along those lines, could you share with us your personal ranking of importance of values? You mentioned notability, we mentioned neutral point of view, you mentioned universal access to knowledge. Does any one of these trump the others? Is there a ranking?
I would think the neutral point of view is the ranking one. I think with regards to privacy versus notability, I think it's a really difficult situation. Depends on individual cases, and there will always be discussions about it. But the neutral point of view and the fact that it's written by volunteers and not sponsored by anyone, that is really important. No advertorials. We've had this discussion in San Francisco a lot of times. One of the interesting things about San Francisco is that you have Silicon Valley. And one of the potential things a lot of nonprofits do is go to a lot of people who became rich in Silicon Valley, which a lot of people did, and they go and ask them, can you share a donation with us? And in our case, so many people came back to us and said, why would we donate to Wikipedia? You have a business model, you just choose not to use it. And we're like, okay. Well, you could put ads on your website, then you'd pay forever, and you'd be fine. We're like, yes, but that's not, the principle is that we need to be neutral. And any ads would imply that we're not neutral. Well, that's your choice. And so it never really worked out for us, and we quickly stopped it, especially as we discovered that we would much rather have lots of small donations than a few big ones.
If you had a choice, I want to go back to something that Dean said in his welcoming remarks. If you had a choice of Wikipedia with more volunteers and more human involvement, or a Wikipedia that is better automated and has more intelligent machines guiding it, which one would you go for? How important, another way of asking the same question is, how important is the human volunteer component in Wikipedia?
I'm going to sort of give a cop-out answer, as they say, and the one doesn't go without the other. If we want to get more volunteers involved, we need to have better technology, and we need to have that verification by humans, and we need to have that color added by humans. And it's similar to what I was saying about the kids project earlier. We have the Wiki Kids project and we have Wikipedia. Both may very well contain the same information, except one is written in the kids' language by a kid, for kids, and the other is written by adults for adults, or could actually be written by children for adults, but the language is different. And the same goes here. The human touch which goes into a Wikipedia article or any of the Wikimedia projects is really essential to us. If we can, however, lower the barriers to entry for that human by using technology and all kinds of other methods of making it really easy to contribute, like ping, oh, you're new in landmark, we haven't got a picture of yet. Would you like to turn west and take a picture? I mean, that is easy. And if we can make those kind of things happen, or would you like to, we have this, but we're missing this source, and you happen to be close to this, can you check this out, and whatever. Those are the kind of things technology can really help us lower the barriers to entry, and I think our most essential part is considering that volunteers are blood of the whole system, is enabling those volunteers with technology is the right answer.
So a not unrelated question is the one that will be at the center of the panel that follows us. The panel that will discuss paid editing, the ethical aspects, as well as the content and quantity aspects. And I guess the same question comes up. Would you side with more opening to paid editing so that we can get more content and broader coverage? Or would you stick to favoring the volunteer aspect of Wikipedia and the crowdsourcing and the wisdom of crowds and keeping out of capitalism and other perceived evils so as to keep the purity of and the human tradition of Wikipedia? So here's the opportunity to trump the panel and have your opinion mentioned earlier.
It's a tricky thing. I mean, first of all, I think paid editing is different from paid advocacy. What we see across the world is a lot of cultural institutions in the GLAM sector are trying to share their heritage with the world. They have one mission. Let's make sure that what we've done, whether it's a whether it's wildlife, whether it's historic events or whatever, let's make sure as many eyes see this as possible. And for example, in the Dutch chapter, they got the National Archive to donate 2,000 pictures, and they not only donate those pictures, but they did research after a year, and they said, you know, on Wikimedia Commons and the use of the photographs in articles, we reached such a bigger audience than we would have ever done if we just kept them on their own website, because people don't go to our website. They don't go there and they don't go look for articles. Wikipedia is the place to be. Government agencies explaining basic things about legal requirements or about certain structures within the country, public structures. Those are all in public institutions which can share an NPOV, because most civil servants, for example, and most cultural institutions are actually pretty good at neutral point of view. Technically, that's paid editing. At the same time, it's making a lot of new content available, and actually most of the libraries do that in conjunction with a lot of volunteers who help them. And we see a lot of things like the Wikipedian in Residence program, where we have Wikipedians come in and be a resident at the foundation or whatever, the library, for half a year to a year, and they help get these programs started and share things, explain the rules, etc. These are really good examples of very useful things to do. And on the other hand, we have organizations that sort of advertise with, you know, if you pay us $1,000 a year, we will watch your article and make sure that this one thing never gets in there. Every time it's added, we'll make sure one of our volunteers, because they basically have fake accounts and everything else, will remove it from the article. And we can win that war because we're there 24/7. We have 100 employees, we're using at least 1,000 fake accounts, and these are exactly the kind of things we don't want to have, because they destroy not just the integrity of the neutral point of view, but they destroy the motivation of the real volunteers. So we have to, and that's one of the few things where the foundation does get involved, we have to make sure that they don't have, there's a way to protect volunteers from them by saying, what you're doing is against our terms of use. And that's exactly the kind of policy we can make. And at the same time, that's a really good example, because we make a policy, it'll be a broader policy which applies to all the projects, but every project can choose to make its own policy on this, and that will overrule ours. So, because ours is the foundation one, if a group of volunteers decides not to do anything special, that's the one that counts. But the Hebrew Wikipedia made a decision, I believe 2 weeks ago, a really clear decision on what they would do with paid editing, and that rules. That's the most important one. So whenever we do something like that, like a policy like that, we still try and make sure that the individual projects have more say about these things.
The Israeli chairman, Itzik, discussed and showed us the results of the recent survey run here. And I know we had a short conversation about this last night. I know that you're exposed to other similar surveys conducted in other countries. And there are some things that struck us as interesting: the gender discrepancy and willingness to get involved, the comparison of Hebrew and Arabic speakers. I was wondering what, if any of those numbers impressed you the most, whether you found any of these different in other countries. Should we have asked other questions?
The most interesting one I found was that I think that if I'm correct, the Arabic population was much more interested in wanting to edit Wikipedia than the surveyed Hebrew population, which I thought was really interesting. And it sort of makes you wonder how you can enable that new audience, because it's really hard to reach them. What didn't surprise me is the willingness of women to edit. I think it's not so much a willingness as in previous experiences on the internet. And I think that's a trend we see in a lot of places where you don't feel welcome. There is a technical barrier, so you're like, okay, maybe not. And I'm not saying it's less technical. It just happens that a lot of our technical professions are dominated by a male population who have their own codes and rules, which really turn away a lot of our audience, which has a lot of knowledge, because traditionally, in a lot of society, women are the ones who have more knowledge and spread knowledge, etc. So it's really ironic that we are so overrepresented on a lot of technology topics and are so underrepresented on a lot of other things. I mean, we had an interesting discussion with our chair, with our ED a week or two ago. She says, yes, I'm really getting involved in the category female Syrian authors. Like, does that category exist? She goes, it didn't before I started. Okay, interesting. And it's like, and of course there's a category male Syrian authors, and as there is in, so those are really interesting examples of how our systemic bias really not just makes sure we don't really have a good full encyclopedia, but also encourages more systemic bias because people don't feel inclined to edit more information.
Speaking of diversity, we mentioned gender, and you talked about accessibility and socioeconomic differences in the context of Wiki Zero. Are there other diversity dimensions that we should pay more attention to?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is, and this is for some people who are more involved with Wikipedia, this has been a longer discussion, is we have a very Western view of the concept of encyclopedia. The concept itself is very Western. You have a body of all knowledge. And we have a very academic view on citation and references. We base it on the Western model of, every article and every fact needs to have a source. At the same time, there's a lot of cultures which have oral citation. Basically, knowledge is passed on from generation to generation. And we as Wikipedia don't know how to work with that. We've tried some experiments with oral citation, and other people said, it's just hearsay, we can't use it. And at the same time, it's like, but it's a hearsay which is being passed down through generations and might not actually be 100% accurate, just like every other source might not be 100% accurate. But it's a really interesting source, and how can we adjust our model to increase that kind of diversity and also include that kind of knowledge, because it's really exciting knowledge to have.
So, speaking of oral citation and crowdsourcing, I think we should open it to the audience and see if there are any questions or comments on the part of participants here. Be happy to entertain questions or reactions. Eli, why don't you start?
Can you repeat the question?
אוקיי, מי שאל?
Question first, then we can repeat it. דבר בכל רמה.
רגע, אנחנו מקליטים את זה, ולכן חשוב שזה כן יהיה למיקרופון.
He'll ask in English, I think.
One of the basic rules of Wikipedia and other projects is that we are collecting and not creating the information. But there is other professional magazines, etc., that you as professor knows them better than me, that use this, what we call it in Hebrew, original research. Mm-hmm. We don't allow to do it in the Wikipedia because we are merely collecting the information and presenting it. Would be a good idea like renovating the Wikipedia to have a project in the Wikipedia or in the Wikimedia project, like a scientific magazine with editors, of course, because you have it you should have it for the degrees, etc. But it is another source for access, because I cannot access to the professional magazine. I have to pay money or even, but should or would the Wikipedia in the future can use this source of information and access to the public for new creation of scientific information?
So how about you do something new for a change?
I thought I just told you about Wikidata. I think one of the interesting things is when I went to Wikimedia like 7 years ago. Okay. Can I give you a second? Someone came up to me and she said, "Oh, have you seen this in this person? I have to give this to him." Like, what is it? Well, it's a Harper's magazine from 50 years ago. And I'm like, why? Well, it's for Wikisource. I'm like, what is a Wikisource then? He said, well, it's what we try and collect out of copyright materials and share them with the other projects so they can use them as citations. So we bring in all kinds of materials that are open. With regards to new research, I mean, there's a lot of open access movements around. I'm not sure how big a thing that is in Israel. The only thing we're really concerned about is the open licensing, and that for us would also be reason to include it. There's no technical reason not to do it, but we haven't seen a lot of enthusiasm from the academic world to use it that way. And we actually do reach out a lot to academics with our Wikipedia on campus things in the US. But I'm not sure if there aren't a lot of other places that also do open access of new research. But if there's a need, we can look into it. But it always starts, the thing is, it doesn't start with us. It starts with volunteers who say, let's do this. So if you find 5 like-minded people, we'll help you. Or Wikimedia Israel will. I just promised on behalf of ITSIC.
Eli, are you going to follow up or shall I follow up?
You're going to make it harder.
I'll follow up. Yeah, I'm going to try to tighten the screws a little bit because I think this is a really crucial question. The fact that academe and Wikipedia have a touchy relationship with a little bit of mutual concern. Shouldn't that lead Wikimedia and Wikipedia to be even more aggressive? Following the first 5 or 8 years of Wikipedia, when it was treated with almost disdain among many academicians, And given the fact that Wikipedia has clearly won hands down that particular conflict, isn't it time to gear up for the next battle, maybe in the way that... Yeah.
So my education interest is really in anything below university level. So you have to forgive me if I'm a little bit out of my depth here. But talking to other people on my board, for example, in the Wikimedia movement, it seems that there are a lot of initiatives that do this already. Is there still a need for us to fill this? Because if there is, then that should have become apparent. And I haven't heard a lot about it. This is the first question I've received about it in 10 years.
Scientific journals are becoming more and more expensive by the day, therefore less and less open and accessible in some fields, and it might be Wikipedia and Wikimedia's charter to make some of that new research information accessible, despite the traditional commercial publishers' barriers.
So I figured that there was a lot of open access already going on and new initiatives, but and we work actually together with some of them. Depends on different chapters and local projects, etc. But if there's a need, we have the infrastructure, and we have something like Wikisource where you could publish this kind of thing. I'm not sure if we're the right platform to get your audience, but we do have the platform where you can upload whatever materials you want, original resource and whatever, research and whatever, and basically publish it there. And it's not so much us creating the knowledge in as you using us for your research, which at that point comes down to how well did you do your research, and you can get the review you want and inviting other people in, etc. And that's we have the talk pages and things like that for. So I'm imagining it's not that hard to create a project around it, and it wouldn't surprise me if I'll get emails tomorrow from other people saying, yeah, it's actually been done in that language, because it's likely it's not that hard to do. Technology-wise, no.
Not to belabor the point, but just one last question. Don't you think Wikimedia and Wikipedia can be at the forefront of developing new review and refereeing processes and practices?
Yes, and we can be at the forefront of a lot of things, and the problem is focus. And I think that's one of our things we do. We really want to try and focus. We have a backlog on technology, and what we really want to do is focus on that, and we want to focus on being able to do grant making to all the local chapters and teams and thematic organizations that are trying to do exciting things rather than us having to do them. And we don't have the time to do all those things. But on the other hand, if volunteers came up and said, we want to organize this, or our chapter says we want to organize this, we will support them in any way we can. And we're getting much, much better at getting infrastructure for support.
I think we have time for...
Yeah. One more question.
אני רוצה לשאול על URAA ועל המחיקות החוזרות ונשנות. זה מתסכל, אז אני רוצה לדעת את העמדה של הקרן, ולמה היא כאילו לא נשמעת.
The question is from the frustrated position regarding the repeated erasures and loss of content and URLA and so forth.
Okay, so that's a tricky issue, as you know. What I understood yesterday from some of the board members that the current situation is better, because, I mean, generally I think it's accepted by a lot of Commons editors that they shouldn't be deleting these images, yet at the same time some people still are. But there really is no good legal solution. We've looked at all the different scenarios, and we've looked at distributed servers in different parts of the world, but how do you make sure that the right server shows the right things, etc.? It's really complex problem. So technology is not going to help us solve it. And it comes down to, again, the same problem is volunteer energy and volunteer positivism, and making sure that you welcome and assume good faith rather than assume bad faith and start deleting all kinds of stuff. And I think one of the things we talked about yesterday is we can have a little bit more technology like this. For example, you know, if you're going to delete a lot of materials, flags should go up and people should be saying, what are you doing? You're structurally editing so much that you're damaging a lot of our content, and is that the right thing to do? But it really does come down to the individual volunteer who should assume good faith and also err on the side of, I'm guessing this is good because it was told by the person who uploaded that it was okay. But it's a tough problem.
Any other questions?
Okay.
I don't think I see another finger, and I think people are awaiting eagerly the discussion about paid editing, or maybe someone needs to be paid to ask a question.
You might have to wake them up. Maybe they fell asleep.
No, I think you did a great job. Jan, I want to thank you on behalf of the board, on behalf of all of Israeli volunteers, on behalf of the community for your visit. We're looking forward to many more years of good cooperation. Thank you for the interesting insights, and have a good continuation of your visit. Thank you, Jan.